Welcome to Module 5, Flexible Billings. In this module, we'll cover overview and workflow, as well as setup, inquiries and reporting, and other billing options. In the overview and workflow, we'll discuss flexible billings workflow, as well as the screens that impact the workflow, such as billing transaction load, auto invoice creation, invoice and adjustment maintenance, invoice review and approval, printing, posting, and then the reversal and duplication. When we think of flexible billings workflow, the time and material projects and the cost plus projects will have the identical workflow in creating an invoice. The records flow from allocator to billings. Fixed price invoices will be slightly different than workflow, and we'll cover that later. We have transactions that come from allocator, which we talked about in the last module. And then once they've been created, we have, similar to what we saw in financials, where we had data that was in AP, GL, and we wanted to bring it over to project controller, and we had that bridge, and the bridge was financial transaction transfer. We have the same concept where we have transactions that allocator created in the project module, but now we need to bring them over to the billing module. So how do we get them there? We have another process or a bridge that brings them from project to billings, and that's called billing transaction load. So the very first step to bring any data over to billings is billing transaction load. Then we can combine all that data onto one invoice by project. So we can run auto invoice creation, and that will generate a draft for us. And then we can print our drafts and see how the invoices look. And if we have changes that need to be made, we can then edit the draft. And then we can do invoice review and approval, which is essentially the approval of the invoice. And this can be done in on the web apps by the project manager, if desired. And then we print the invoice final. And once the invoice is printed final, then we can't edit it anymore. And the last step is we need to post it. So the invoice posting is the last step. We have an alternative workflow that we can do. So this workflow I just described is if you have a lot of projects that you're billing at one time, because if you think about how this would work is you would have a bunch of allocation records that created billing lines, and these billing lines need to be pulled over. So we can load all the billing lines over into flexible billings for the month or the week or 2 weeks, whatever your time frame is that you're invoicing, and you'll bring it over for multiple projects. So instead of going one by one through the projects and creating an invoice manually, we can run the auto invoice creation, and it takes all the line items for each of the projects, puts them on their separate drafts, puts it in a completed status, so then we can go ahead and print them in preliminary and see if they look okay. That's a fast way to do it instead of just manually creating the invoices one by one. But we do have an alternative where we can do them one by one. So let's look at the alternative workflow that we would have, where we would have our line items in project transactions created by allocator. We still would run billing transaction load because that would bring the data over into billings. But then instead of running auto invoice creation, which automatically creates my drafts for me, I could instead go into invoice and adjustment maintenance, load my lines separately onto a draft, and then follow the same workflow where I'd review the invoices and approve them, and then I'd print them and I'd post them. So let's look at some of the screens that we will use to accomplish these steps. So related to billing transaction load, we will, let me get over to my, so processes, the first one we'll use is billing transaction load. This is that bridge that I mentioned. With this process, we have a couple choices. We can run it for a specific fiscal period, and that will bring all the existing billing lines from the allocator created over to flexible billings for that period. We can narrow that result by including a cutoff date. So if I want to run it for the first week or the first 2 weeks of the month, I can include a cutoff date, and so it would prevent later records from pulling over. I could also add a filter to just bring over a specific project. And we've been working through this project that we ran allocator on in the last session, and we'll go ahead and pull these transactions over. And you'll notice when I run it, I ran it for the month. It brought all 4 lines. So I have, if you recall, we have 4 things that we created by allocator. We have materials, subcontract, labor, and travel. And we had 4 separate, one line for each of those. So when I ran this process, we got 4 lines that were created. So those were brought over to Billings. I'm going to say OK. If I wanted to, I could run it by the GL sub-account on the project, but that's a filter I don't use very often. So once I have this process here, then the next step is to run auto invoice creation. Auto invoice creation is where it will create the draft for me. I can filter by a biller, so I can, if I have certain projects that I'm billing only and other people bill different projects, then we can associate a biller to those projects. Now I want to go look and see who my biller is, so I can restrict my process to just my job. So I'm looking at my job, and the biller is Andrew Clark. So I'm going to restrict mine, so just my job comes over. Andrew Clark is my biller. And now I can choose if I wanted to cut off date again to restrict the items that did show on the invoice. At this point, I don't really care. I'm just going to put today's date because I want all my records to flow over. And then I'm going to do create invoice. You'll notice what happened. It says one invoice was created, and it created a draft 80011 for project C0111. Now, if I had a bunch of other records for other projects, I would have seen separate drafts created for each one of those jobs. So the first step is billing transaction load, run by the period, can use a cutoff date if desired. The second step is to run auto invoice creation. Here we combine existing lines onto a specific draft for us. The draft is set to completed status, and this is an easy way to bring over or to create drafts for a large number of transactions. Now I want to review those line items, and I can do a print, invoice print preview, and so I can run it in preliminary mode. I'm going to choose my project. So I could run preliminary mode, and I could choose a set of drafts. So all the drafts that would have been created would have been in a range. And then this will allow me to view the draft before I finalize it. It's important to review the drafts and understand what data is on it, see if it's displayed in a way that makes sense, or if it's supposed to have it's separated in a different way, or if it's supposed to show in detail and it's showing in summary. Usually you have the proper invoice format set up on your projects, but it's good to review them and make sure the line items that you have. So this is the draft that I have. You'll notice it shows as a draft, and it has, this is more of a generic format, but it shows that my employee was an architect, and who the employee is, and then it includes the number of hours, the hours and the billing rate, and then the amount. And we can change the invoice format to include headers. So right now my format does not include any headers, but that's a fairly simple fix. I also see that I have travel expenses, and it shows the account, and the amount is $250. I also have materials for the $550. And I also have my consulting for my my AP document that I entered, and it's for $750. So the total invoice is the $55.50 that we had anticipated that came from allocator. I can choose to save this if I want. I can export it to the desktop, or I can just print it to a file if I want. I'm just going to save it to my desktop as a document for the time being. So once I'm comfortable with my invoices, maybe I wanted to realize I can't bill all 40 of those hours. So then the next step could be, well, I could edit that invoice, and that's step 4. So going back to my list of items that we've already run billing transaction load, we've run auto invoice creation, we've run the invoice in preliminary. Now I'm going to review the draft and review edit. And this will allow me to make the change because I know I'm going to need to write off some of those amounts. So let's go up to Invoice and Adjustment Maintenance. This screen is the heart of invoicing. So regardless if it's a fixed price invoice or cost plus or time and materials, this is the main screen where we can add lines, edit lines, change lines, things like that. So it's very important that we understand how the screen works and the power of this screen that's available to us. So here's my billing project, and I already have a draft. So here's my draft. And you'll see that I have my 4 lines. Now it's in a completed status, so as long as it's not printed, I can edit it. So I'm going to just come here and I'm going to change it back to in process. And I will choose to write off 10 hours here. So I'm going to write down 10 units. And you'll see that it changed the write down column to be $1,000. So the amount column is the column that will be billed. I have 3,000 here, 550, 750, and 250. Now if we scroll to the right, we can see the amount that came from allocator, and it's clear over here, it's called a ridge amount. So if you're ever curious or you're not sure what the amount of allocator is, you can see that this is what was loaded through billing transaction load. And this number stays the same regardless of how I change the invoice. However, if I write down an amount, it will adjust my billing amount to be 3,000. So I went from 5,550 to 4,550. And we can see this on the document summary where we have the original amount, net amount, and so forth. Dynamics also gives us the ability to have sales tax and retention and customer deposits as well. So it's not just the records that come over from allocator to the invoice, but we can also include sales tax and those type of things. So to do that, we have a tax, retentions, and deposits tab. Now normally with sales tax, we would associate a sales tax ID to the project and it would calculate it for us automatically. Or I can come over here and I can add sales tax if I want. For purposes of this invoice, I'm not going to include sales tax, but you can also see that I could add retention, which means it would reduce the amount we're going to bill the customer because we're going to retain that. If we put retention on an invoice during the course of the project, then later we can go ahead and bill that retention here as well. We can also send an invoice for a customer deposit, and we can also later apply that deposit to once we invoice them. Each one of these choices has a different account category that we'll post to in GL postings that will result. So that's the reason for the different classifications. The other thing I can do is I can type invoice text on here. So for a specific information for this invoice that is different than other invoices I would charge for, invoice for that project. So that allows me to put text about content of this invoice that I want the customer to be aware of. Now let's go ahead and view this invoice and we'll see how it's changed. So once we change an invoice, we don't see the write-up or the write-down on the invoice itself. We'll just see the net amount on the invoice. However, when the invoice is posted, it takes into account that I brought 4,000 over, and it'll post accordingly. When we generated the record through Allocator, it went to unbilled AR and unbilled revenue. So then for $5,550. But when we post this invoice, we're only generating an invoice for $4,550. So what happens to that $1,000? Well, it's going to clear out unbilled AR and unbilled revenue for the entire $5,550, and then there'll be a revenue adjustment for the $1,000, and then we'll get a net billing of AR for $4,550 and revenue for $4,550. So this is our invoice now. You'll see that it's now $3,000 instead of the $4,000. And so the net is $4,550 at this point. So I like that invoice, even though I can't bill it all. That's more accurate than what I had before. So I'm going to save that. I can also, let's go back here and look at our PowerPoint. And so this step, the next step after I'm happy with my invoice and adjustment, is that I can do invoice review and approval, and invoice print, and then invoice post. But before we do the invoice review and approval, I want to show the alternative workflow, because 6, 7, and 8 are identical regardless of which process you use. But let's talk through this step, this alternative workflow, if we didn't use auto invoice creation. So go back to my invoice, and we're going to pretend that this draft never happened. So at this point, I am going to unselect the items from the draft. So I'm clear that my selections. I'm going to save it. Now it will not get rid of these items because they're still going to be queued and waiting to be billed. I'm just going to unlink them from a draft. So I'm going to delete the draft, and I said, yes, I want to delete. So we're back to the process where we've run billing transaction load. That's already happened. Now we're going to load our lines through invoice and adjustment maintenance manually. And to do that, I'm going to go back here. I'm going to open invoice and adjustment maintenance. And I'm going to choose my project. And then I'm going to put my cutoff date. I could put it the 01/31 is my cutoff date. And then if I hit display, I must have some transactions that are later than this date. So I'm going to actually make this today's date, and I'm going to hit display. So the reason 2 of them did not pull through when I chose the 1/31 date is that 2 of them have a 6/23 date. So once I made that date higher, they pulled in without any issue. So this cutoff, or this ending date, can work as a cutoff date to allow you to bill 2-week time period or a week time period. Now that these records are here, I can choose select all and then save. So I'm back to the same place I was as when I ran auto invoice creation and it created a draft for me. So the only difference is I ran billing transaction load and I manually created my draft myself. The lines are available to put on an invoice. I just did it manually instead of having the system create it for me. I'm in the same position that I was before. I still want to write off 10 units. So I wrote off my 10 units. Now we're ready to continue through the rest of the workflow. So we go to invoice review and approval. And how do we know who is the approver on an invoice? So if I go to my billing information, it tells me who the approver is, which happens to be also Andrew Clark. Normally we wouldn't have the biller and the approver be the same person, but for simplicity's sake, we made them the same person. So I can go to invoice review and approval, and I can choose my employee, Andrew Clark. Oh, it's not there. So you know why it's not there is because my invoice is still in process. So if I change my invoice to completed, now it will be available for approval. So you can go back to my invoice review and approval screen. Now I'm going to choose Andrew Clark. And sure enough, there's my invoice. Now I can review the invoice here. I can view the detail. This just drills me back to the line items on the invoice itself. I can see a summary. That's the same as my document summary. So this is just allowing me to assess that invoice a little bit more detailed. Now I can change it to approved, and all I have to do is hit save. Now if I come back to my invoice review and approval, taking you back here because I want you to see that at any point in time, this screen has the current status of the information. So you see now my status here says approved. Before it said in process and completed. I'm still not to the point where I can't edit this invoice. If I found an error or I still need something changed, I can still change it. But once I've printed it in final, that's where I no longer can make my edits. So the next step would be to print the invoice final, and then the final step is to post it. So let's go to our slide that shows the print final. So we just did the invoice review and approval. And now we want to do invoice print. So that's the same screen you saw me at before. We did find out though, based on watching what I've done, I have the ability to view the invoice from this screen as well. So I could preview it here, or I could go back to my invoice review, my invoice print screen, which is here. And now I want to print in final. And I actually don't want it to print to a printer, so I'm going to choose to print it to my file so I don't print it. Okay, so I'm going to actually print it to you see I can choose Adobe or PDF or Word. I'm going to choose Word at this point. And I'm going to go ahead and print final. And I want to choose my draft because if there's other drafts out there, I really don't want to print those in final. Now the key on this is this invoice date becomes critical because this will be the invoice date on your AR document when you generate it. So this is important as far as what date you want on this for purposes of aging. I'm going to print it, and it will assign an invoice number to the document, and it will essentially make that invoice unavailable to process any further except post it. Okay, now my invoice printed to my file, and if I come back over to invoice and adjustment maintenance, you'll see now my status says printed. So at this point I'm in good shape. And the last step is to post it. As we go along, I want to show you, at the end of the presentation, I'll show you how to look at some reports, but I think it adds value as we go now. So there's an invoice in process report, and when I run this report, I can see the status of all my invoices. So if there's any invoice at all in the system, it will show on this report, and it'll show me if it's in process, if it's completed, if it's approved, or if it's been printed. So at the end of each month, you'll want to run this, even throughout the month, you'll want to run this report to ensure that it includes the items, or if there's things that haven't been processed that you need to consider and process. Okay, we'll let that report finish. Now, let's go back to our PowerPoint, and the last step is to post it. And to post it, I can come back to and I'm going to choose Invoice Posting, which is Invoice and Adjustment Posting. So I've gone past the point of no return as far as changing that document. This is the point of when I get an AR record and I get actually some accounting happening. Everything up to this point has been workflow, so I don't get any data that's generating, updating my project at all. But I'm going to post, and I'm going to use that same biller ID because I want to restrict it to post just my document. I could put my invoice cutoff date so I don't post anything after that date, but that's the only document I have. So I'm going to go ahead and hit begin processing. You'll notice this is the period it will post to, and it finds all invoices that have been unprocessed for that biller, and it's saying it's processing invoice number 92. So it created batch number 1007 for that invoice. Now let's go look at that invoice look at the status again in my invoice and adjustment maintenance screen. And it should show that it's posted. So I've completely walked through the entire workflow for this invoice from start to finish. So it's all the workflow is all related to helping you ensure that your invoice is accurate and helping you to be able to have workflow around approval and then obviously final printing it. But at this point, let's say we sent the invoice to the customer and they said, we did not agree to pay for travel. And so we disagree that we can pay for travel. So I go check with the project manager. Sure enough, I can't bill them travel. So now what do we do? Once an invoice has been posted, the only solution we have is to reverse it. And we'll do this in the invoice reversal and duplication screen. You can see from this screenshot that we have two buttons available to us. One is duplicate, and this is not to reverse it, but to copy an invoice we've already made and create another one exactly like it. The reversal and reverse document one is the one we'll use. Let's go and look at this screen and we'll just walk through the steps to do that. So we'll go to the invoice reversal and duplication screen. I'm going to pull up my project. And I'm also going to pull up the invoice that I created. It has some really key information here. So if you're ever looking for when did this invoice process and what period did it post to and things like that, we can see all that information in this screen. I can see the amount of the invoice and I can see the period it was posted to as well as the invoice date. In this bottom left-hand corner, this is the key component of the reversal and duplication. It's very important before you click reverse document that you choose the right posting period, because at the time I create this invoice, it will generate essentially a negative document, exactly like my original document. And essentially when it's posted to AR, it will create a credit memo for me. The challenges, or the thing that sometimes users do incorrectly, is they don't choose the correct posting period for the credit memo. So most of the time I don't know exactly right after I've sent this invoice that it's wrong. It's maybe a month later or something like that. And so the timing of when you make this reversal and the period you use is critical for getting the credit memo to the period you desire it to be in. So if I come here, this will always default to my current period. And most of the time, customers want their reversals to be in the current period. But if you wanted it to be in a different period, you should change this period before you hit reverse document. I'm going to click reverse document, and you'll notice it says it created invoice 93 and draft 80013. That's the reversal document. Then the draft for the new document, or the document I'm going to fix, is document 80014. So I'm going to pull up 80013 here, and let's look at it. So right now, the period is already defined, and I cannot reverse an already reversed document. So I could not reverse this one. But if I made a mistake again, I could actually reverse the reversal. So you just, let's go look at the invoice that it created. So if I pull up my job, I should see a couple more documents available. So this 12 was the first one that I created, and it's still in a posted status. Nothing about this invoice has changed. Now and this was for a positive 4550. But if I look at the reversal document, which was number 13 it created, you'll see I have a negative 4550. It still says invoice, but when it goes to AR, it will create a credit memo. You'll also notice that it's a printed status. That means I cannot edit this document at all. And why wouldn't we want to edit it? Because it should be an exact reversal of the first one. So we would not want to edit a credit memo that it's reversing the original one. We want to just push that one through till it's final posted, and then we can generate a new invoice. Then the final one that I got was draft number 14, and you'll see this is still in draft. I don't have an invoice number for it, and it is in process. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to post the credit memo or the reversing document. So I'm going to go back to that invoice review, invoice posting screen. I don't have to print it because it's already been printed. I also want to just post my reversals. So I'm going to put my Andrew Clark in there, but if I put in 01 for my period, it's going to reverse every document that's been posted, that's been designated as that reversal period. I'm going to process it, and sure enough, now I've generated my invoice batch with batch number 1008. So now if I come back to my invoice adjustment maintenance screen, you'll see that this document has been posted as well. So now my original document's been posted, my correcting document's been posted. Now all I have to do is deal with the correcting document. So come in here, and just like I wrote off 10 units here, I can write off the entire $250 here. So I'm going to type in write down of $250. Notice I typed the $250 in rather than typing in the units. I can go either way. Actually, I want to write down the one amount, 1 unit. Wait, I'll get this right. Okay, so I have 500 units. I'm going to write down the whole 500 units. There we go. And I'm going to write down $250. Okay, so now my amount is 0, and my write down is 250. So now my invoice is 4,300. That's perfect. I'm going to change it back to completed, and then I'll follow the same exact workflow that we've done before. I print it, file, and then I post it. Key thing about reversals, it creates an invoice with the units and amounts reversed, just like we saw. Both the reversal document and the new draft number are created, and you can you cannot reverse the original one again, but you reverse the reversing one if you need to. But it will create an in-process draft for us. We're going to go back and look at the invoice register report that we had started earlier. I printed it to file. And so here's the invoice register report that it generated. You'll see that I have several invoices in process in various stages. This one happens to be completed. So you'll see it gives me that the status is completed and it's awaiting approval. So this report will help me know the next step as well. This one is printed, awaited posting. So for this project, that's the one we were just working on. Now it's obviously past the posting part because I just posted it. But this gives you an idea of all your unprocessed invoices at a given time in a month. We've walked through the workflow if you have a correction to an invoice on the line items that exist on the invoice. But we need to also think about what if you have time cards that were not included on the invoice you just created, or the time card line item that was on the invoice was incorrect. So we can make adjustments directly in the screen if we want to. So if I come here, I have the ability to add lines to this screen if I want. So on the fly, if I know there was something that wasn't invoiced, I can type it in here. The challenge with that is, so $210, I can directly put it here. The interesting thing is it'll show it as a negative write-down, which essentially means a write-up. I'm adding a line. So 210 is the key field is the amount is going to be billed. It's asking me to also enter my project and my task. So I want to associate it to a specific task, and I want to put it to an account category. So maybe I had more materials that I wanted to bill. So I could manually add a line on the fly. However, you also need to consider, especially if you have time card issues that didn't show up or the time card was incorrectly entered, do I really want to make entries directly on the invoice, or is it better to go back to the original time card? That's a decision your company needs to make, but a lot of times we want audit trail as far back as we can go. So it's preferable to make the correction to the time card, run it through Allocator, bring it back over through billing transaction load, And we already discovered we can manually load line items to an existing invoice. So let's say you've already created your draft, it's in process, and you realize you needed another line. Go ahead, correct your time card, bring it back through. The correction, if it was charged to this job and shouldn't, would create a negative line item to this job and back off whatever time card line we already had. So it's easy and clear, it's a clean-cut way to do it, and you have workflow all the way back to your source document. Same with this materials. If you're expecting this AP voucher to come through and it just hasn't, probably adding it as a separate line item may not be advisable as well, because again, next month that $210, if it comes through a voucher, would be coming back through directly to the invoice. So you want to be careful on the edits and adds that you make to this screen and understand the implication that there could be data upstream that will be coming to this invoice at a later point in time. There's a lot of flexibility. It's just a matter of what policies your company wants to put in place related to accomplishing your invoicing.